Hi, I'm Heidi Arens, and I am a nurse practitioner at the Center for New Medicine. Today I'm going to be talking about mold illness, what it is, how we can identify it, what the symptoms are of it, and then what can we do about it, how can we treat it. So a lot of people have heard about mold. Obviously we can see mold if there's spoiled food and there's mold growing on a food. A lot of people don't know that mold can grow also in buildings, in cars, anywhere where there's potential water damage. And actually within 48 hours of water damage from usually a leak, a flood, some kind of water intrusion into a building, you can have mold start to grow. There's different kinds of molds, hundreds of different kinds of species of mold. And some are visible and some are not. Some you can smell and some you can't. So sometimes you may not know that you have mold, but if you've had any form of water damage in a building, an office building, a house, a car, a basement, there is always a potential for mold. So I want to just talk about what you may experience in the body in terms of symptoms, and then also how do we identify this in the body. So if you are exposed to mold, the most common type of symptom you would experience would be an allergic type reaction. And that's when the body releases histamine and you get things like watery eyes, itching, rashes, coughing or wheezing, headaches, sneezing. And those are typically allergic responses to mold. And a lot of people are allergic to mold. Mold is toxic to the body. But sometimes this can actually cause a chronic infection or a chronic illness. And that's because 20% of the population have defects on their HLA genes, which actually impairs your immune system from recognizing mold as being foreign and toxic and mounting the proper response. So the people I see with mold illness or mold toxicity, they actually usually have HLA gene defects. And so if you have 100 people in a building are all exposed to the same kind of mold, maybe 2 people, the other 98 people are perfectly healthy and their immune systems mount the proper response and can actually eliminate mold and it doesn't become a chronic problem. If you have an HLA defect on your HLA genes, sometimes you can mount a response to mold, but it's an inflammatory response, and the immune system gets stuck in this ongoing inflammatory response. So the immune system gets activated, but it doesn't know what to do about it. So it stays activated and it stays inflamed. When that happens, we have a whole host of different symptoms that can occur. And it can start off kind of gradually and get worse over time. So a lot of times people will say, well, I was perfectly healthy and fine and didn't have any health concerns. I had a leak in a roof or a flood in the kitchen or a flood in the bathroom. And ever since that flood, I've noticed my health has never been the same. I've had chronic fatigue, I have brain fog, I can't think, can't concentrate, trouble learning new information, trouble with word forming or speech, getting your words out in a sentence that's clear and articulate. People can have allergic type symptoms ongoing, like allergic rhinitis, where they have just chronic inflammation in the nose, itchy nose, watery eyes, that can affect the lungs, and that's when people will have chronic lung infections, chronic bronchitis, chronic pneumonia, chronic asthma even, or what can look like asthma, but when you treat asthma and test for asthma, everything's fine in terms of staying, but they have ongoing symptoms of asthma, shortness of breath, wheezing and coughing. Also, the digestive tract is an organ where it gets exposed to mold just because of biofilms that can form in the gut, some fungus inside, and so you can have a lot of GI distress. That can be nausea, vomiting, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, and then also chronic pain, inflammation, sore muscles. You can have damage to nerves where you have neuropathy or shooting pain, zapping pain to the hands, to the feet, throughout the body. You can have electric shocks that actually can even be enough to break a watch. I've had people say, wow, I've broken like 3 watches in the last couple of months, and it's because the body actually will produce electric shocks in response to some of the electrolyte imbalances and changes going on. Also autoimmune issues. Because mold suppresses the immune system so severely, people can get autoimmune conditions or even immune suppression, and they can have ongoing immune issues because of the fact that their immune system is constantly being activated and it can't mount the proper response. So what do we do about this? How can we actually test this in the body? There are urine tests that we can do, and so we call those urine provocative tests, where we will actually test the urine for the presence of mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are the toxin produced by the mold spore. So we don't test the body for the actual mold. You can inhale, you can be exposed to a mold spore and inhale a mold spore, but in the body what gets produced and what the issue is called a mycotoxin. So it's really a mycotoxin illness, and we're trying to identify where in the body could a mycotoxin be and which kind and in what amounts, because then we can use the right treatment and the right type of binder to actually bind that mycotoxin and get it out of the body. So we can do urine testing for mold, where we would capture your urine, usually a first morning urine, and send it to a lab. There's a couple different labs we use to do mold testing, and we look for the presence of mycotoxins. And sometimes we'll use glutathione or some other form of detoxification before the urine collection, just to get some of these mycotoxins moving and mobilized so we can actually capture them. We do want you to be on a mold-free diet for at least a couple of weeks before this, so that we're not capturing any molds that you could be consuming from your foods. And then if you have something called an Hla defect, which is a gene, part of a whole bunch of genes in our immune system, where there can be Hla defects. These people, when they get exposed to mold or biotoxin, even Lyme disease or other types of infectious organisms, they can come down with what we call chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and we call it CIRS, C-I-R-S. And that is a chronic, ongoing inflammatory response to a mycotoxin. And so when that occurs, there are a whole host of blood tests that we can do in the body to look for these markers that indicate a chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And they're usually quite unusual tests that aren't done in a routine blood work panel that you would normally have done. So if you go to your doctor and you say, I feel inflamed, I feel achy, I feel pain, I feel fatigue, I know there's something wrong, and they do kind of a standard workup, they're often looking at ER, erythrocyte sedimentation rate, or they're looking for CRP, C-reactive protein, and those actually are normal a lot of the time in patients with mold, and it's actually a totally side of the immune system that gets activated. And so sometimes it goes missed because we automatically think general inflammation, but it's not the general inflammation markers that we're looking for. It's actually the complement system and a whole host of other labs that we can look for. So there is very particular labs that we would be drawing if we were suspecting mold illness in somebody. And then what do we do about mold? If we detect mold, what do we do about it? Well, the first step is we have to get you out of the moldy environment. So we cannot get you better until you're actually out of the building or out of the office or out of the vehicle where there's water damage and there's constant mold exposure. We can treat the body for mold, but if you're constantly being re-exposed on a daily basis, inhaling mold spores or getting them in the body, then we can't make much progress until we actually remove you from the constant source. So that's step number one. Once you're out of the environment, then we can proceed with helping the body detoxify, getting all the detox systems working. And that means we need you breathing well, we need you hydrated, we need the kidneys working and the digestive tract working and the stools being eliminated and the lymph moving. So we have to work kind of from a systems approach to get all these systems of detoxification working as smoothly and efficiently the largest source of treatment comes from binders, and we use oftentimes prescription binders, and they're called bile acid sequestrants. These are actually old cholesterol drugs that have an off-label use for mold-related illness, and that's because they have the ability to bind mycotoxins. So they can bind these mycotoxins from the bile, which is where they're typically stored and found in the body, remove it from the bile into the digestive tract, so you eliminate it through the stool. And so that they're strong binders. They often have to be taken several times a day for many months to be able to have a good effect of getting that burden of mycotoxin down. There are some natural binders, things like chlorella, activated charcoal, zeolite, silica. All of those other binders can be helpful, but it totally depends on the type of mold and the polarity of the mold or the mycotoxin that we're looking at. So they can be helpful with certain types of mold, but they're not helpful for all kinds of mold. Sometimes we use those binders, those natural binders like activated charcoal or zeolite, as a mop to help mop up some of the toxins that are being produced in the body once we start mobilizing all these things and trying to detox the body. So sometimes they can bind mycotoxins specifically, and then other times we're using it kind of as a cleaner upper, a mop to help soak up all these extra toxins and get them out of the body. And then we also use phosphatidylcholine, which is it's actually a form of a lipid, and we can do it IV or oral. Here we do a lot of phosphatidylcholine IV treatments, and it helps to restore cell membranes so that you have healthy cell membranes that can get nutrients into the cell and toxins out of the cell. Mycotoxins are very toxic to mitochondria and cell membranes, and so when cell membranes are no longer communicating and you can't have good cell-to-cell communication, you don't have good healing, and you don't also have good nutrient absorption or the removal of toxins from the cell to outside the cell so that you can get rid of it. So we repair those cell membranes with phosphatidylcholine, and then we also have to support the body nutritionally. Nutrition is absolutely paramount because we're doing a very big detox process with the body, and that's very nutrient and energy taxing on the body. So we need to restore minerals, restore vitamins, give the body a lot of nutrition back so that it has something to fight with. We also use ozone here in the clinic. We also have a laser treatment, the endo laser, and so those are both IV treatments that we do, and they help to improve detoxification and oxygenation. And also you can also do ozone therapy at home too if it was something that you were having to do on a very long-term basis. We teach patients how to do that. We also do other forms of ozone in the clinic that can be helpful if you can't get an IV. And then what can you do now that you know a little bit about mold? How can you check your home for mold? How can you check your car, possibly your office space? And then what can you do to prevent mold? So that's where we actually partner with experts who do mold testing for the home or the office. A lot of times we need to get a very clear picture of what's going on in the home, and that does require mold testing, and there can be many different forms of mold testing. And the tricky thing is finding someone who's very well informed, very well educated and trained to detect mold and to test for mold. So you can test drywall if you actually have visible mold or visible water damage, wood, hardwood, drywall in the actual home where the damage occurred. You can also do air testing, and that's where they will capture the air from inside a room, compare it to the air from outside the home to see what the mold spore counts look like. There's another form of testing that you can do called the ERMI testing. It's ERMI, and it stands for the Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. And what that means is it actually will test dust samples of mold within the home and look for the DNA of mold. And so you can have old exposures, new exposures, and you can still detect the DNA from that mold. Even if it was 10 years ago, you could still detect DNA from mold. And so that does give people kind of a clue as to, okay, if I knew of a leak 10 years ago, I thought it was taken care of, but maybe it wasn't. Or you bought a home and you weren't really told about any form of mold in the environment before, but now you're sick and you've detected mold in the body. So then you have to backtrack and go, okay, is there still some sort of mold exposure here that I need to be aware of and deal with? And that is a tricky thing, because if there is mold in the home, sometimes you can salvage some of the furniture and whatnot, but sometimes you do have to get rid of things, because anything porous like books, paper, wood can harbor mold. And so you don't want to be taking those things from one home to another and you're still getting constant exposure to it. So we do teach patients how to do this, how to navigate this very challenging process. It's something that we do see quite often. It's very common. 20% of the population has defects on their HLA genes. So they may be fine, but if they get an exposure, that's when their body just cannot mount that proper response. And so now you know a little bit more about what mold illness is, what we can do about it, how we detect it, and I'm excited to answer any questions you may have.